The rain stopped. The clouds broke, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean, silent, and supposedly empty of the ancient terrors that had once walked the earth. For generations, the story was simple. The waters rose, the ark held, and the slate was wiped clean. But the earth remembers what history tries to bury. Centuries later, in the dust of the valley of Elah, a young shepherd named David stood before a wall of muscle and iron. He looked up, and up, and up. The creature before him was not a man. It was a remnant. It was a contradiction. If the deluge had truly consumed every trace of the pre-flood world, then how did a giant stand in the valley, breathing, taunting, and ready to kill? The silence of the receding waters was not an end, but a pause. Somewhere in the shadows of the post-flood landscape, something had survived the tide. The question remains, hanging in the air like the scent of ozone after a storm. How did the bloodline endure when the world was meant to be reborn? The battle that should have been impossible had only just begun. The answer lies buried in a single, chilling clause tucked into the 6th chapter of Genesis, verse 4. The text reads, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after that." 3 words, and also after. For centuries, scholars have stared at those words until their eyes burned. They represent a crack in the foundation of the post-flood narrative. If the deluge was a total reset, a divine scrubbing of the earth, then what does after mean? It implies a continuation, a bridge. Some theologians argue for a second incursion, a fresh descent of the Watchers long after the waters had receded. Others point to a more terrifying possibility, that the genetic code of the giants was never fully erased, but merely dormant, waiting in the bloodlines. It suggests the flood was not a finality, but a filter. It removed the surface, but the deep, ancient corruption remained beneath the silt. The slate was not wiped clean. It was merely rewritten, leaving the door open for the giants to return to the valley, to the mountains. If the written word leaves room for doubt, the legends offer a terrifying clarity. We look to the figure of King Og of Bashan, a name that echoes through ancient tradition as a monument to defiance. The waters had consumed the horizon, turning the world into a vast, churning grave. Yet, according to the accounts passed down through the centuries, one massive frame refused to sink. Imagine the scene. The Ark, a singular vessel of salvation, tossed upon the violent, rising tide. And there, clinging to the very side of that wooden sanctuary, was Og. His hands, thick as tree trunks, gripped the damp timber. His massive frame, built for a world that no longer existed, fought against the crushing weight of the deluge. He was not merely a man struggling for breath. He was a living anchor of the pre-flood era, refusing to be washed away by the divine mandate. The water rose, the currents pulled, and the storm howled, but he held on. This was not just a story of survival. It was a physical breach of the barrier between the old world and the new. By clinging to the Ark, he ensured that the bloodline of the giants would not be lost to the abyss. He brought the ancient terror into the post-flood dawn, a silent, hulking passenger on the journey to a reborn earth. The rabbinic tradition does not merely tell a story of survival. It presents a calculated physical defiance of the divine order. Scholars dissect the narrative of King Og not as a miracle of luck, but as a deliberate intrusion. Consider the sheer scale of the man. His existence was an anomaly that the floodwaters were meant to erase, yet he remained. By clinging to the Ark, he did more than save his own life. He maintained a direct, unbroken link to the antediluvian world. He was the bridge. When the waters finally receded, Og stepped onto the new earth, with the same strength and the same ancient forbidden nature he possessed before the rain began. This was not a rebirth. It was a continuation. He carried the memories, the stature, and the genetic blueprint of the giants into a world that was supposed to be scrubbed clean. The tradition suggests that his survival was a deliberate act of preservation, a way to ensure the legacy of the Nephilim would not vanish into the silt. It had simply been allowed to walk free, waiting for the right moment to reclaim its place in the valley of Elah. The world had changed, but the bloodline remained. If the legend of a single giant clinging to the hull feels too overt, the alternative is far more insidious. We must look to the interior of the Ark, to the wives of Noah's sons. This theory posits that the purge was not as absolute as the narrative suggests. It proposes that the genetic markers of the Nephilim were not destroyed, but carried across the divide in the blood of the survivors. Imagine the biological reality. Recessive genes, dormant and hidden, traveling within the very people tasked with repopulating the earth. The Ark becomes an unwitting vessel, a sanctuary that inadvertently preserved the forbidden lineage. These women, perhaps unknowingly, acted as the bridge for a genetic legacy that was meant to be erased. The floodwaters could wash away the cities and the giants themselves, but they could not scrub the code from the human genome. This is the theory of maternal carriers, a mechanism of survival that operates beneath the surface of history. It suggests that the giants did not need to physically board the vessel to endure. They simply needed their essence to be woven into the fabric of the new generation. The deluge had failed to close the door on the past. It had merely moved the threat into the shadows of the future. The implications of these recessive genes are not merely historical, they are structural. Once the Ark touched land, the genetic clock began to tick. We are looking at a biological bridge that spans centuries, where the traits of the Nephilim remain dormant, hidden beneath the surface of normal human development. This is the genetic time bomb of the post-flood world. A child born generations later might appear entirely unremarkable, yet carry the latent capacity for the stature and strength of the ancients. It is a matter of probability and lineage, a slow-acting mechanism that ensures the bloodline survives even when the giants themselves are long gone. Think of it as a hidden code, woven into the DNA of humanity, waiting for the precise biological conditions to trigger a resurgence. The environment of the new world was different, but the fundamental blueprint remained unchanged. This theory suggests that the emergence of a giant in the Valley of Elah was not an isolated freak occurrence, but the inevitable outcome of a long gestating genetic process. The flood did not eliminate the threat, it merely forced it into a state of deep biological hibernation. Every generation became a potential carrier, a vessel for a legacy that refused to be extinguished. The threat was no longer an external force, it was an internal reality, a persistent shadow. We must now move from the realm of genetic theory to the cold, physical reality of the desert floor. In the caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea, archaeologists unearth fragments that challenge our entire understanding of the deluge. These are the Book of Giants, a collection of scrolls that do not merely describe the Nephilim from a distance, they offer a window into their internal world. These texts are not the work of later historians or mythmakers. They are presented as first-hand accounts, providing a perspective that has been buried in the dust for millennia. The scrolls bridge the gap between the biblical narrative and the reality of the pre-flood era. They detail a world where the giants were not just monsters of legend, but active participants in their own history. By examining these fragments, we shift our focus from the biological transmission of traits to the documented intent of the beings themselves. The scrolls reveal a narrative of calculated survival, where the giants were aware of their impending end and took deliberate steps to preserve their legacy. The Qumran texts force us to confront a chilling possibility, that the giants left behind a written record of their existence, a testament that was never meant to be found. The Qumran fragments reveal a shift in the internal world of the Nephilim, moving from dominance to a profound, gnawing dread. It began with the dreams. These were not mere hallucinations, but vivid, recurring visions of a world submerged. The scrolls describe how the giants saw the heavens darken and the foundations of the earth shatter long before the first drop of rain fell. In these visions, they witnessed the total erasure of their lineage. The impact on their collective psyche was immediate and devastating. They were no longer the masters of the landscape. They were the targets of an approaching absolute judgment. This realization stripped away their veneer of invincibility. The dreams forced them to confront the reality that their strength, their stature, and their influence were finite. Every night brought the same crushing weight of impending doom, a relentless cycle that turned their existence into a countdown. They saw the waters rising, the mountains disappearing, and their own works being washed into oblivion. This was a tragedy of foresight. The dread of the coming flood did not paralyze the Nephilim. It ignited a cold, calculated urgency. They stopped looking at the sky and began looking at the earth, assessing what could be salvaged from a world destined to be erased. This was not a chaotic scramble for safety, but a methodical operation of preservation. They understood that their physical forms were vulnerable, so they turned their attention to the architecture of their legacy. They sought out the deepest caverns and the most resilient stone, carving their history into surfaces that they believed would withstand the weight. They gathered their knowledge, their genealogies, and their forbidden arts, distilling them into compact, durable forms. They mapped the geography of the future, identifying high-altitude refuges and hidden caches where their records could remain undisturbed. By the time the first clouds gathered, the groundwork for their legacy was already buried, waiting for the waters to recede. The scope of their preservation efforts extended far beyond stone tablets and carved records. Some theorists argue that the most critical cargo was not biological at all, but encoded. They propose that the Nephilim possessed a sophisticated understanding of genetic and informational storage, translating their forbidden knowledge into a format that could survive the deluge. This shifts the narrative from simple survival to a calculated, long-term conspiracy. The theory suggests that the Ark itself may have served as a vessel for these hidden archives, carrying the blueprints of an ancient, non-human lineage through the storm. These artifacts were not meant to be found by the survivors of the flood, but were strategically placed to be recovered only when the earth had dried and the new world was vulnerable. This introduces a chilling possibility that the flood was not merely an act of divine cleansing, but a catalyst for the preservation of a dark, encoded legacy. The idea that DNA or forbidden data could be hidden within physical objects transforms the landscape of history into a puzzle, where every discovery is a potential reactivation of a dormant, ancient influence. The water did not just wash away the old world. It acted as a filter, protecting the most dangerous elements of the pre-flood era until the right moment for their reemergence. If the flood was a total erasure, why do the legends persist in the highest places? We turn our gaze to the jagged peaks of Mount Hermon, the original site where the 200 Watchers first descended to Earth. This was not merely a point of origin, it was a fortress of altitude. As the waters rose, the geography of the world shifted, but the summits remained. Theorists now examine the possibility that these heights served as a literal refuge, a sanctuary untouched by the global catastrophe that claimed the lowlands. The air at these elevations is thin, cold, and unforgiving, yet it provided a barrier that the rising tide could not breach. Consider the logistical reality. If the Watchers understood the coming destruction, they would have identified the one place where the water would fail to reach. This creates a terrifying tension. It suggests that the deluge was not as absolute as the records claim. While the valleys were scoured clean, the peaks may have held the remnants of the old world in stasis. The realization hits with the force of a physical blow. The catastrophe was not as absolute as the ancient texts suggest. If the peaks of Hermon remained above the waterline, then the flood was merely a local erasure, not a global reset. We are forced to confront the possibility that the Nephilim did not rely on divine favor or wooden vessels to escape the rising tide. They simply retreated to the thin, frozen air where the water could not reach. This changes everything. It means the new world was never truly new. It was a landscape already occupied by those who had outlasted the storm in the shadows of the high-altitude crags. Think of the logistics. A small, isolated population surviving on the jagged edges of the world, waiting for the oceans to recede. The chilling truth is that the bloodline remained intact, hidden in plain sight among the clouds. Every valley was already being watched. The flood had failed to purge the earth. It had merely pushed the remnants into the heights, creating a dormant threat. The physical survival of the bloodline was only the beginning of the horror. We must look beyond the flesh to the deeper, darker reality found in Second Temple demonology. When the bodies of the Nephilim fell, their essence did not simply vanish into the void. Instead, their spirits were cast out, lingering in the post-flood landscape as disembodied entities. This is the shift that changes the nature of the conflict entirely. We are no longer tracking a hidden population in the mountains. We are dealing with a permanent, invisible infestation. These entities, stripped of their physical forms, became the demons that haunted the ancient world. They moved through the air, unseen and untraceable, influencing the minds of the new generation. The water had washed away the cities, but it had failed to cleanse the earth of the Watcher's influence. This explains the persistent, inexplicable darkness that plagued the post-flood era. It was not just a memory of the old world. It was the active spectral presence of the Nephilim themselves. They were the architects of the new chaos, whispering into the ears of kings and driving the rise of ancient empires. The threat had evolved from a tangible enemy into a spiritual parasite, ensuring that the corruption of the pre-flood world would never truly be extinguished. The battle had moved from the valley floor to the very air we breathe. The haunting was not merely an accident of history. It was a calculated strategy of survival. We turn now to the Sumerian myths of the Apkallu, the seven sages who served the ancient gods. These figures were not just mythical advisors. They were the guardians of forbidden wisdom. According to the tablets, they buried their secrets deep within the earth before the waters rose, ensuring that their knowledge would survive. This mirrors the desperate, prophetic preparations of the Nephilim. We see a chilling pattern emerge. The giants were not just brute force. They were architects of a legacy. They encoded their secrets into artifacts and buried them in locations known only to their kin, waiting for the mud to dry. The Apkallu and the Nephilim shared a singular, dark purpose: to ensure that the pre-flood reality was never truly forgotten. The secrets were waiting, buried and ready to be unearthed by the next generation of kings. The burial of knowledge was only the first layer of a much deeper, more insidious design. We now confront the most controversial and chilling hypothesis. In the study of ancient giants, the serpent seed theory. This concept challenges the idea that the post-flood survival of the Nephilim was a mere accident of biology or a desperate act of hiding. Instead, it proposes that a non-human lineage was intentionally, surgically preserved for a specific, dark, prophetic purpose. This theory suggests that the corruption was not just a remnant of the past, but a deliberate planting of a new, hybrid reality. If the bloodline was maintained, through the chaos of the deluge, it implies a level of foresight that borders on the divine. We are forced to ask, was the survival of these traits a glitch in the divine order? Or was it a calculated move by those who sought to reclaim the earth? The serpent seed theory posits that the post-flood world was not a clean slate, but a landscape seeded with a hidden, alien agenda. This was a biological time bomb, ticking beneath the surface of human history, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. It suggests that the giants were not just enemies of the new world, but the intended future of it. The conflict was not over. It had merely been encoded into the very blood of the survivors. The theory of a hidden lineage finds its most concrete evidence in the pages of the Bible itself. As the post-flood history unfolds, the terminology shifts. We no longer see the term Nephilim used in the same context. Instead, a new name emerges from the shadows of the ancient world, the Rephaim. This is not a mere change in nomenclature. It is a diagnostic marker of a biological reality. The Rephaim represent a diluted, yet undeniably persistent version of the original pre-flood giants. They are the physical proof that the bloodline survived the deluge. We track their presence across the geography of the Levant, from the high-altitude strongholds to the fertile valleys. Every mention of the Rephaim in the text serves as a chilling confirmation that the slate was never truly wiped clean. The genetics of the Watchers, while perhaps diminished in stature or power, remained active and dangerous. This linguistic transition reveals a strategic adaptation. The giants did not need to be the towering titans of the past to exert their influence. They only needed to exist. By the time we reach the Valley of Elah, the Rephaim are firmly established as the primary antagonists of the new order. The name itself carries the weight of an ancient, unyielding legacy. The water receded, but the bloodline endured. This is the moment where the academic study of ancient texts collapses into a singular, harrowing realization. The flood was meant to be the absolute end of the corruption, a divine reset of the human experience. Yet, as the dust settled, the ancient enemy was still there. It was not a ghost of the past. It was a living, breathing presence. The shock is not in the survival itself, but in the permanence of the threat. We look at the records of the Rephaim and see more than just names on a page. We see the failure of the deluge to purge the earth of its original stain. Every mention of these entities in the later scriptures serves as a reminder that the enemy never truly left. They were waiting in the high-altitude refuges. The realization hits with the force of a physical blow. The world was not saved, it was merely occupied. The ancient non-human influence had successfully navigated the cataclysm. This was the ultimate betrayal of the promise of a clean slate. The bloodline had survived the rising tides, the shifting geography, and the passage of centuries, only to emerge stronger and more deeply woven into the human story. The enemy was not coming, it was already here. The realization that the ancient enemy remained was not the end of the story, but the catalyst for a new, brutal chapter. We move from the study of ancient lineages to the tactical reality of the battlefield. The remnants of the Watchers were no longer a myth to be debated. They were a force to be confronted. This was not a conflict confined to the dusty scrolls of antiquity. It was an active, ongoing struggle that demanded a response from every generation that followed. The battle between man and the remnants of the Watchers was only just beginning. We see the shift in the landscape, from the quiet aftermath of the flood to the tension-filled valleys where the giants once stood. Every encounter, every skirmish, and every defensive stand was part of a larger, relentless war for the survival of the human order. The presence of these entities forced a permanent state of vigilance. There was no room for complacency when the enemy was embedded in the very geography of the land. This was the transition from history to duty. The struggle was not merely about the past, it was about the present, and the necessity of standing against a force that refused to fade into obscurity. The lines were drawn. The echoes of the Valley of Elah do not fade. They resonate through the centuries, a reminder that the flood did not wash away the architecture of the ancient world. We are left with a chilling question. If the bloodline endured the greatest catastrophe in human history, what makes us believe it has vanished now? The patterns remain. The shadows in the high places, the whispers of forbidden knowledge, and the persistent, dark purpose of a lineage that refuses to yield. We look at the world today and wonder if the struggle is truly over, or if we are merely living in the quiet before the next surge. The history of the giants is not a closed book. It is a warning written in the soil, the stone, and the very DNA of our collective memory. What happens when the remnants decide the time for hiding is over? The silence is not peace. It is anticipation.